Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and we are currently sprinting as fast as we possibly can through Hyperion, the last of the four books being the Rise of Endymion. And we have lots to talk about all the time about this book. I feel like almost every episode, well, not every episode, I haven't done this for a little while. These books are really dense. There's a lot of stuff that's happening, and I love the way that Simmons is kind of like jumping around for different people's viewpoints of the story and what's going on. And I think I've said this before. These books are kind of like a Quentin Tarantino type thing where it seems like all of these non sequitur things happening randomly in different places that eventually all add up to the final culmination of this one big thing happening. Very chaotic, but in a good way. So I've generally enjoyed reading the book. I hope that you guys have as well, or if you at least enjoyed listening to me talk about it endlessly. Well, maybe not endlessly, but just quite a lot. So, yeah. But generally, like I said, I'm very excited to continue talking about it, and I'm hoping that we'll get through. We'll be able to get through it pretty quickly here. So, last we talked, I think that where was I at exactly? Gosh darn it! I think we had just talked about Father Captain DeSoya and where he was at. So we're gonna pick up where we left off with him, which is actually, it got interesting really quickly. So the last that we had talked about DeSoya, everybody who was on his ship, or not everybody, at least Father Gregorius had been coming to him for confession, and when he was going to him for confession was basically saying like, hey, I don't feel good about what we're doing, and I feel like we are committing genocide here against human beings. And that ousters are human beings who, deserve credence as, conscious beings, conscious sentient beings. And that was the last that we had heard from that ship. And I talked about how I thought it was kind of interesting that DeSoya basically told Gregorius, like, don't worry about what it is that you're doing. You're just following orders. There's no need for you to, like, do anything with this. I think I had mentioned that the ship that they were on, the Raphael, was associated with healing miracles. So I thought that was interesting. But like I just said, things kind of hit the fan really fast with that. So the next chapter that we get, where we go back to DeSoya's neck of the woods, there is a gentleman by the name of Leibowitz or something. He has this very like proper sounding name, and apparently he's an aristocrat from Renaissance Minor, which has been kind of the Renaissance vector itself, has been kind of a hub for activity throughout most of these books, and I assume that that's because Simmons references so many things from the Renaissance. But he is the spy that the Pax put on the Raphael to ensure that Father Captain DeSoya wasn't going to pull any funny business, because he already has once. So they put the spy on the ship, and they get to the last the last system that they have to, they're the last system in they're basically the last system in their mission, and for them to I guess take over. They're not really taking anything over. They're taking no prisoners, so it's not like they're taking the land. And most of the places that the ousters live are pretty uninhabitable by humans as they currently are. So they get to this last system, which I think is called Lucifer's system, which is interesting that they saved this for last. And they're kind of starting to, do their business and blow everything up and kill people being ousters. And the spy on the ship, it starts out from his point of view, which I thought was really interesting. I liked that, Simmons threw in this character who, now that we've read all four of these books, or we're reading the fourth book, we're like almost every time we run into a character, it's kind of like, oh, is this going to be a new guy? Are we going to hear about him a lot? Like, it's funny. It feels like it's just so hard to tell who's important and who is not. But he is sitting in the captain's chair thinking that nobody else is going to be there because he's the spy, and then DeSoya walks in with Gregorius and 7 other crew people, and this spy is thinking like, oh, there's no way that they'll mutiny. I know that they've been in confession a lot, which is weird, and I should probably report it, but like, mutiny's not like, they wouldn't mutiny. This isn't the 1400s on old Earth, as he calls it. And then they mutiny. So DeSoya actually decides that he's going to try to steal the Raphael from the Pax, which is a big deal because the Raphael is an Archangel class ship that has like an instantaneous drive and these crazy fast resurrection crashes and like all of this other stuff that just makes it like an insanely valuable asset. And so for DeSoya to decide to steal it is just absolutely crazy, but also just crazy enough to work because it kind of does. So he is obviously he changes his course, and because he's in like a battle formation with another ship, the other ship being the Gabriel, which is another Archangel name. I don't know what that one is associated with off the top of my head. I would have to go back and ask my original source of where I got the other information from, but I cannot do that currently. Regardless, the captain of that ship hails him, and he basically says, like, I got secret orders. Did you not get secret orders? And she's like, oh, well, why don't you just let me confirm those secret orders? And then she checks, like, the comm logs, and it was, in fact, a rendezvous point thing that they were supposed to go to. And she says, oh, okay, but I got this one. You got a different one? Like, why don't you slow down and we'll chat about it? And DeSoya's kind of like, yeah, let me do a thing with that. And the whole time that he is, talking with her, he's loaded up a death beam, which we've talked about several times before in the context of these books, where death beams are like they're like the death wands, where it's just kind of this instantaneous flash of light or like type thing, and then everything that it has like this specific genetic marker just dies. The death beams in this particular case just scramble up your brain cells. But the nice thing about death beams when you're on the or when you're Catholic is that they don't matter because you just get to die and come back. But you are dead for 2 days, which gives the person who's running away from you or whatever enough time to get away from you, which is pretty good. Or, enough time to like tie you up and then, yeah. Anyway, we don't need to go into that. I'm sure it'll come up eventually. I mean, it kind of already did with Corporal Key. So, but regardless of that, we find out that about 8 people on DeSoya's ship have decided to mutiny against the Pax because they will no longer participate in this mass genocide. And so they're going to man everything on the Raphael. And one of them is, of course, General Gregorius, which is great because I would have been really upset if he wasn't going to continue being a character, because he's the one who gave the confession where he talked about how awful it was that he was killing all of these ouster babies. So exchange between Father Captain DeSoya and the other captain, who I think is Mother Captain Stone, is the way that her name or title goes, is interesting because they're kind of like playing poker. And it's funny that DeSoya mentions he specifically has lost to her in poker several times. So they're both standing there with this like invisible trigger to shoot a death beam at the other ship to stop them. But DeSoya is able to stall her long enough to where his ship has accelerated to a point where it won't stop easily, and the coordinates where it's jumping to are going to be like easily altered, I guess would be the right way to phrase it. I'm not totally sure. But basically, he's going to be able to accelerate up to that C+ translation speed faster than her ship can, so he'll have a head start on her. Even though he'll die when he gets there, she would have to like come up with a way to like, you know, get there and not be dead as long as he would. Anyway, you know, he'd have a head start, so he would win. He'd just continue to run away again and again and again. But he doesn't have to, because he pulls the death wand trigger, or the death beam trigger, and she does too. But again, the whole thing is that if she didn't pull it earlier, then his ship was going to be able to translate no matter what she did, even if she killed everyone on board his ship. So I don't exactly know why Simmons has her pull the death beam trigger as well. I think the biggest thing, or the biggest reason why she does it, is mentioned by DeSoya, is that if it looks like she didn't do her absolute best to stop DeSoya, then she's going to get excommunicated and then executed, which is a big deal because that would mean she dies the true death, which is undesirable, right? I mean, like, personally, I would never want a cruciform to make me immortal, so, I mean, I guess if everybody else was immortal, it could be somewhat reasonable, but regardless, I think the biggest thing here is that most people in the packs are not interested in experiencing the true death anytime soon. And she kills him, he kills them, and then we kind of jump away from that pretty quickly. As far as like chronological order is concerned here, we're going to go backwards in the book, but technically forwards with somebody else's story. So we're going to talk about Rawl. And I just had the name of the planet that he's on, but I can't remember it now. And I also had the name of the spectrum that he was talking about in my head, but now it's gone as well. So I do apologize. But he's on the moon of a planet where there's a specific group of people who believe in this French philosopher's spectrum, or philosophy of this like particular type of spectrum that has to do with like color and knowledge and love and things like that. And it happens to be like a very important part of their society. So the last time that we talked about Rawl, he has kidney stones. And I had mentioned specifically that I think that Simmons has had kidney stones at some point in his life, because the way that he emphasizes how painful it is to have kidney stones just makes me feel like he had them and was like, I have to write about how awful and horrendous this is so nobody else gets them. I've definitely been drinking more water since I read how much pain Rise of Endymion claimed to be in. So Dan Simmons, if you ever listen to this, thank you for saving my kidneys, I suppose. But anyway, Endymion is finally able to pass one, if not the kidney stone, and he is supposed to be like tracking whether or not he passed it, so he has to, you know, urinate in a filter and all this jazz, which I think is what you're supposed to do if you have kidney stones. I don't know. Never have had them, knock on wood. But he finally passes the stone, and as soon as he passes the stone, the guard handcuffs him to a pipe and says, like, okay, you're good to, or you're gonna get picked up tomorrow. And Endymion says, wait, I'm a prisoner? And he says, you never weren't. Obviously, the packs are, they're not happy that he's there, especially since he's an off-worlder, and they don't really get off-worlders on the planet or the moon that he's on, because what we find out is that the PAX has shut down the spaceport. And the way that we find out that the PAX has shut down the spaceport is that Radamanth Nemes and her crew show up on the same moon that Rawl is on, and some shenanigans ensue on both sides. So we're going to talk about that right after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. That is our first commercial break of 7. Just kidding. It's only like 3, right? 3, yeah. One less than the number of segments that I record, which is 4 15-minute segments. Imagine if it was 15 15-minute segments. That would be crazy. Do they even have podcasts that long? They have audiobooks that long. This audiobook is 29 hours long. Earn like 6 accomplishment badges in Audible when I listen to the full whenever I listen to a full Hyperion novel, which is pretty funny. I have the Guide to the Perplexed on there, but that's like 80 or 100 or some ridiculous number of hours. I took a little pause on that because it's just so much. The first few books are like almost exclusively on translations and phrasing, and anyway, it's a book by Maimonides, one of the philosophers that we've mentioned a couple times. Really theologian in addition to being a philosopher, but he's one of the people who I think Simmons is basing some of his belief structure off of. But back to where we were at, which was the moon that Rawl is on, and how Radamanth Nemes and her 3 siblings have also arrived on that moon. So we know Rawl has passed his kidney stone and is being held as a prisoner. He falls asleep and is woken up by the one of the women in the house, the one who saves him on the street. And she basically tells him, like, hey, you've been talking in your sleep, and Endymion has been having these dreams about talking with Aeneas, one of which she says, you're going to dream this dream at this point in time, and I know that you will, which I think is crazy. And she kind of goes into detail of some of like the weird things that might be going on with her and why the Corps is after her and things like that. But regardless, she tells him that you're going to dream this dream. She tells him, like, these are the things that are important, and he keeps saying her name and talking about the one who teaches and this type of stuff. And the people who are holding him in their house realize that he is of importance. And then the truth tell that was given to him when he was first interviewed by the doctor, they also realize that he is someone of a great deal of importance, because the philosophy that they live by talks about the one who teaches and accounts for the one who teaches, which I think is very interesting. It's kind of funny. In junior high or high school, I had an idea to write a book based off of what it would take for one person to represent, or one entity to represent, the Messiah to multiple religious sects. And then I was going to write a book about how everyone was fighting a war over trying to get a hold of this person. And each planet was going to have like a different sect of religious people on it. And it's kind of funny that Simmons like has this similar idea, except for in reverse, where like one religious entity is after this person, and it's not even really the religious entity that's after them. It's the thing that's running the religious entity that is after them. So I think that that's very, very interesting. That, you know, I have this theory that there are like these common ideas that happen within certain types of creative like mindsets. It's why you hear or see a lot of stories that are told in similar fashion. It's why there's a meta narrative or an overall archetypal type of narrative, and there's multiple versions of that archetypal narrative that are, you know, very important and worthy of note. And I think that that is in part because there is this weird sense of like commonly known, commonly perceived type of creativity from specific individuals, or like that exist. Anyway, it's I don't know. It's kind of a big thing. It would take a long time to describe, and perhaps I'll go into detail in it at some point. Needless to say, it kind of aligns a little bit with the way that Simmons is probably going to have this book round itself out. But we'll get there. I haven't finished it just yet, so I'm not like foreshadowing anything. I just want to be clear about that. But I am suspicious that there is going to be some sort of like communal consciousness type thing going on here. But that's just a guess, again, because I don't really know. But Rawl is freed by the people who he is staying with. They drug the guard and then take him, and basically they go to a trapdoor in their house, and then all of a sudden he's underground in this giant labyrinth of tunnels. So these people are clearly not necessarily all that cool with the PAX, and have been doing anything that they possibly can to make sure that they can bypass the PAX authority in a number of different ways, which is interesting because there's specific mention made of the fact that they will not allow the PAX to search their homes without a warrant. So it's interesting that like the PAX is still kind of tied up in this weird bureaucracy created by human beings. All the while, the Technocorps has sent these like superhuman time travel soldier people to try and stop Rawl, who's just this dude with a kayak, and like these superhuman time traveler people who could like kill you without like. Random Themis at one point says like she could literally walk up to a person, rip their guts out, and walk away, and no one would know what happened. They would just see the person standing next to them like be eviscerated instantaneously. Like the amount of destructive capability that they have and could wantonly use is like comical, and it's even more comical that like the paperwork of a human bureaucracy ensuring the rights of individuals is enough to slow them down and prevent them from catching Rawl. Because when Nemes arrives on the moon, she's like, okay, I'm just gonna like, have you seen any of these four people, to the guy who's there? And he says, no, we don't get off-worlders except for that one ship of people who had the four guys who abandoned ship. And we have the fourth guy in custody, we think, but we haven't confirmed yet. We're going to bring him in tomorrow. And she's like, okay, we'll see you later. So she jumps in her dropship to leave, and he says, like, no, you can't do that. You're not allowed to fly that dropship in space. And like even just the tiny amount of like every little holdup that happens for Radamanth Nemes and her siblings is part of the equation to Rawl's escaping from them on this planet. Because he's been, bedridden for days and hasn't been able to do anything because he's been in so much pain. And then Radamanth Nemes, this superhuman soldier who was basically like shot with a spaceship laser that designed to like destroy like buildings, like that ship laser could wipe out like entire cities. Like it could just like comb over the top of the state of New York and just level everything there. And they shot it at her for like 3 full seconds, and it didn't even kill her. It just like trapped her in the rock. So like it's just really funny that these tiny little delays are holding up this like superhuman, super powerful thing. And I think that that's part of, I know that's part of what it is that Simmons is trying to achieve with this type of stuff, is that he's basically saying like, I think he's kind of like a chaos theorist in the same way that, like I've mentioned before, Quentin Tarantino. It's like, oh, all of these things are seemingly non sequitur and they seem to have nothing to do with anything. But suddenly all of these things add up to the final result of this like crazy, beautiful, weird thing happening. And like all of these things, had they not happened in this precise fashion, would have made a completely different outcome possible. Even like in Simmons' book, the act of Aeneas knowing and telling Rawl, and then Rawl now knowing what he knows, is part of the equation to make the thing happen that needs to happen. So like, if Aeneas doesn't say the exact thing or within a certain realm of the exact thing, then the thing that she saw might come to volition, won't come to volition, because as Aeneas has said, the future is fluid, right? Time is fluid. And I think that we are going to get to a point where, similar to the movie Arrival, Simmons is going to be kind of like, oh, time is fluid, back and forth. But Radamanth Nemes starts to fly towards Ral and Endymion. But I want to bring up something that I thought was interesting before we get into what happens with Ral and Radamanth Nemes and everybody. Because there is this little exchange that happens between Ral and Endymion and a Catholic priest who shows up to try and convert Ral. And Ral is just very blunt with this guy. This guy starts talking to him about like the sacrament of Jesus Christ and blah, blah, blah. And he tries to talk about Pascal's wager, which I'm not sure if that's something that I've mentioned here before or not, but just in case you're reading this book with me and you're not familiar with what that is, I wanted to take a moment to describe it. Pascal's wager, because Simmons doesn't do a super good job in my opinion. Pascal's wager is essentially that, and this is what Ral and Endymion undermines. He says there's more than two options of how to live, but Pascal's wager essentially posits that if I am to live my life in a way that Jesus, or in a way to where I believe or espouse that God does not exist, but God does in fact exist, then when I die, I will suffer the consequences of having believed and acted as if God did not exist. However, if I act or live in a way and act in a way that God exists, and God does in fact exist, then my reward is what God says it will be, which is eternal life. If I act in a way that God does exist, but God does not in fact exist, then his argument is that ultimately all he has done is lived in a particular way. And so the consequences of the decision to live in a way that where God doesn't exist are much more substantial than to live in a way in which he does. Because if God doesn't exist and you act as if he doesn't exist, then great. But if he does exist and you act as if he doesn't exist, then you're screwed. But if you act in a way, but if he does exist and you act in a way where he does exist, then you get rewarded. And if he doesn't exist and you act in a way that he does exist, then nothing happens. So really, the number of desirable outcomes for acting in a way that he does exist are greater than the number of desirable outcomes that would happen if you acted in a way to where you believe, or acted in a way to where he didn't exist. So that's kind of the basic premise of the argument. And I think that part of what makes that wager not necessarily as hapless as Ral and Endymion would claim that it is that if you are someone who believes that the living in a way that the Bible states is pragmatic is desirable, then you know it becomes even more reasonable for you to act as if God does exist. But what I think is interesting is that the priest conflates belief with the act of taking the cruciform, and I think this is one of the biggest issues that people run into with the church in general, is that there is this mysticism surrounded by the compliance of individuals to what it is that a governing body, i.e. the Catholic Church, says. And that is not something that's written into the Bible according to most Protestants. In fact, I've heard many debates by Protestants claiming that is just a flagrantly misinterpreted verse that the church uses to support the idea that they ought to exist and that they ought to be an arbiter of morality and social contract within Christianity. And I think that is another thing that Endymion fails to mention, is that like the belief in God is not something that should be considered to be public. It's something that is private, and that is part of that's inarguably part of what the Bible interprets it as being, is private and between you and God. And the fact that the church is conflating, or the priest is conflating all of these things, really kind of makes Endymion's blood boil. So we're going to finish talking about what it is that Endymion says in response to this priest, but that'll be right after this quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back, everybody. So right before the break, I was talking about the conversation that Endymion was having with the Catholic priest who had come to visit him while he was in dire straits, I suppose. And basically the fruition of this conversation is that Endymion ends up telling the priest that he wouldn't want to be a part of any church that bars a little boy from life-saving treatment from cancer because he doesn't have a cruciform, and he isn't willing to accept the rule of the church over his life. And the family doesn't want to have to break up their entire family just so that they can get this life-saving treatment. Because what's interesting and worthy of note is that the Pax medical treatments might be able to save this boy's life from cancer without the application of a cruciform. So they're not only not willing to administer the life-saving surgeries and treatments necessary for him to live without a cruciform, but they won't even try to save his life unless he has a cruciform and is a member of the church. And not just him, but his entire family, as I mentioned in the last episode. So Endymion is pretty much straightforward with this guy. And what's interesting about this is that this is right before he falls asleep, and then wakes up to the family saving him. But when he falls asleep and has a dream, Aenea's asking him, why did you turn down the cruciform, and why have you always turned down the cruciform? And he basically says, he says at first that it is because of what he said to the priest, and then she says, okay, but even if they didn't make you take the cruciform, would you accept the church? And he says no. And then she starts to ask him, why wouldn't you accept the church, and why wouldn't you accept God? And he basically just kind of comes down to the conclusion that he just doesn't believe that there is a God that is meaningful or worthy of worship in some capacity. And at this point, Aenea kind of starts to go into why it is that she is considered to be a virus by the Technocore, because she can infect people with a certain type of, I guess, awareness would be the right way to put it. And I think that this awareness is something that could be likened to kind of a spiritual awakening. And part of the reason that I think this is important is because, or is relevant, or is maybe even something that's a possibility, is because during the conversation when they're talking about Blaise Pascal, Endymion mentions that Pascal was alive during a very specific time for a reason. And that part of the reason that we remember what it is that he said is because of the timing of which he lived his life and the fact that his life ended ultimately. And so Endymion is kind of making the argument that, like, the idea, it's a very Nietzschean argument, the idea that, like, things on this earth don't matter because there is a life eternal option. So I think that we'll probably run into this particular idea a few more times, but and in fact we will even just today in talking about the whole thing of, like, Endymion's struggle with faith. But Endymion seems to be very much like your classic kind of not necessarily Jobian protagonist, but just this very similar figure to a lot of, like, you know, when you do a play like Fiddler on the Roof, for instance, one of the things about the main character of that is that he's always having this dialogue with God of, like, why would this horrible thing happen? And, like, you know, am I just supposed to accept that this horrible thing happens? You know, that my one of my daughters becomes dead to me because she marries a Christian man, and, you know, that we're getting kicked out of our neighborhood by the Russians, I believe it is, because I believe they're in Russia. And so they're like, and why are they forced to live in, like, not necessarily squalor, but definitely not nearly in the living situation that they would like to live in. They're very limited on their access to resources and their ability to advocate for themselves. They're kept on the outskirts of society. They basically live in, like, it's basically a Jewish ghetto, right? Not ghetto in the sense of, like, the colloquialism that we're most familiar with in the States, but, like, ghetto in the sense that it's like a clearly differentiated area of land that is being loaned to these people by the government and is eventually given away to other individuals based off of their lineage. And that's part of why everybody in Fiddler on the Roof has to leave and ends up either going to America or other places. So yeah, that is kind of, it feels like that's part of Endymion's role. But getting back to Endymion, they go down into these tunnels. Endymion notices that, like, this family is helping him, and they're becoming complicit in, like, every aspect of rebellion that would get them in a lot of trouble, if not killed. And he doesn't really want them involved, but he knows that there's no way that they can't be at this point. So he's kind of just at their behest, at the behest of their kindness, which is something that Endymion is not a fan of, and it actually comes up later on in what's going on with him, because he specifically kind of has this epiphany where he realizes that there's all these other people who have been fighting for him, and he's not fighting his own battles because he's being so careless in his attempts to be heroic. And I think that this is part of, like, a very interesting hero's journey that we're kind of being taken on that we didn't get in other books, because those other books were about large groups of people, and the personal development of those individuals wasn't necessarily the main aspect or point of the book. But I think that because these books are named after Endymion, part of what we're going to see is this, like, meta-narrative, archetypal narrative type thing where Endymion is the one who is constantly, like, improving or changing or developing as a person and as a character in a multitude of ways. And I think that is absolutely worthy of note in multiple regards. So Endymion is guided down and basically snuck out of these tunnel systems on a little wind barge. And he finds out that this moon actually experiences a very brief period of total and complete darkness because of a double eclipse that occurs once every, like, 18 years. And Endymion has just so happened to have landed on that planet within, like, a week of when that's supposed to happen. And when the family comes to save him, they say, like, we have a radio scanner that lets us listen into what's happening with the Pax, and they're sending someone to get you now, or someone is coming to get you now. And the only reason they even know that is because Radamanth Nemes didn't follow the orders of the people in the bureaucracy or communicate with the people in the bureaucracy of the Pax on this moon, that she was like, doing something. But she's not supposed to be doing the thing that she's doing according to everybody who's there. It's supposed to be like a secret mission from the Techno Corps. So yeah, it's just funny that all of these things, all of these little tiny bits of the puzzle are adding up to create a certain instance. So Rawl finds out that the entirety of the city is basically in on getting him out of there safely, which I think is very interesting. And so he gets to this wind wagon that they have,
which is like this crude little sail thing that's solar powered. I don't know exactly how to describe it. I don't think it's necessarily that important, but his kayak is already there. They brought it up and put it in this wind wagon. So they take him down to the river and put him out in the kayak, and he starts to paddle downstream. And he's about to make it to the Farcaster portal when he sees this like crazy flash of light. And this is in the middle of the double eclipse. And in this during the double eclipse, there's also a bunch of celebrations and things like that. And there's just all this beauty that's around him that he's kind of like soaking in, but simultaneously not able to really appreciate as much as he would like to. I think that part of the exercise of him writing the book is appreciating all of the beauty of the things that he didn't get to appreciate in the moment because his life was in danger. And he looks up on the riverbank and sees basically the same kind of combat that he would have seen on God's Grove occurring between two different bodies. He can't tell what they are. He does say that one has 4 arms, though, which to me immediately was like, oh, the Shrike is here. And that is absolutely what happened. So concurrently, concurrent with Endymion's escape and the assistance of his escape from the house is the arrival of Radamanth Nemesis and her 3 siblings. She has, they're all clones, and she has one female that's identical to her and then 2 identical males. And the one of importance here is Gyges. So she and Gyges actually leave the ship and go off on their own, while the other 2 siblings go with the Pax military to do the house-by-house search. And so she apparently, we find out, has the ability to smell things in the same way that a bloodhound does, but even better. And so she basically downloaded rolls sent to everybody, and she can fast travel or slow travel depending on how she wants to manipulate the sphere of time around her. And as we've mentioned before, like the amount of energy that she needs in order to do that is just absolutely ludicrous. But what's particularly worthy of note that she mentions is that the core can transfer her that energy from the core. So there's some sort of connection that she has through some sort of thing that basically allows her to do that. And so she fast travels to the house that Endymion was in because she can smell him, and then goes down into the tunnels and realizes that she's gotten there just after they've left, which is not a big deal to her. She's not worried about it at all, because as long as he's still on the moon and hasn't gone through the Farcaster portal, they can get him. But she's about to go out and leave, and all of a sudden the Shrike appears out of nowhere and just basically rocks her, I guess would be the best way to put it. In that the Shrike punches, I don't know, the Shrike's not a he necessarily, though I think they refer to it as a he. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't, though. It seems like Simmons is pretty dead set on referring to gender only when it's like part of understanding why a character might behave the way that they behave, or in the like other sense of like metaphor for Adam and Eve, or illusions, or religious reasons and things like that. So it seems like that's not necessarily of his concern. I think he calls it most of the time. So, but the Shrike punches her so hard that she gets embedded into rock again, which she's not very happy about. And she can't really move for a couple minutes. And then we flash over to Gyges, who's running through the city and is standing on the canal watching Endymion get in the water. And what's really interesting about these super soldiers is that they constantly do these little things that are like a little bit too human, a little bit too or stereotypically evil, where they're like, oh, I'm going to let them live in this moment and then take care of this person. And he's kind of talking about why he's doing this, and part of it is that he needs to wait for Endymion to get close enough to the Farcaster portal that when he goes down to, in fast time, grab the kayak and Endymion, it looks as if he's vanished to the people who knew that he's supposed to vanish. So he's about to go do that, and then the Shrike appears. And I think it's interesting that the Shrike seemed to struggle against Nemes in some regards on God's Grove, but I think that was because the Shrike was trying to prevent harm done to Aeneas, and it hadn't shown up it had to show up at a specific time in a specific way and fight in a specific way to give the illusion that it was beatable by these people in a specific way. And so when it shows up to attack Gyges, there's no holds bar at this point. The Shrike uses all 4 of its arms immediately. In the past, it's kind of like fought with 2 and then unfolded the other 2. But it fights him with all 4 of its arms. And the results of it do not go in Gyges' favor. Let's just say that. So we're going to talk about that right after this last quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Alrighty, we are back from our last commercial break. We're in the home stretch, everybody. But don't worry, we'll be back on Sunday with more Hyperion stuff, obviously, because Hyperion stuff is what we're talking about. We're in the Rise of Endymion, in case anyone gets confused whenever I mention Hyperion stuff. I think it's called the Hyperion Chronicles or Hyperion Saga, so that's why I say Hyperion. So we were talking about how when the Shrike goes to fight Gyges, it does not go Gyges' way in any shape or form. Gyges can't detect the Shrike coming up at a fast time because he can't detect the field disruption that he normally would be able to detect, which I think is interesting that the Shrike has this ability to sneak up on even like the most sensitive of these beings. And then it basically just proceeds to destroy him. It's the first instance in which we see anybody of Radamanth Nemes's group get killed, because even she wasn't killed by the Shrike. She was able to fight it off, but Gyges just is absolutely not. It basically dismembers him once, and then twice, and then decapitates him with its mouth, and then throws his head into the river and leaves his eviscerated body on the shore, all in a matter of what would have been like tens of thousandths of a second, which is not good for Gyges, because what happens afterwards is that, of course, Raul Endymion gets to go through the portal, and we'll talk about him. If we get to him today, we'll talk about him a little bit more, but there's another story that we need to talk about here as well that has happened in this time period, so we may or may not get to where Raul is at this week. We might have to wait until Sunday for that. But Radamanth Nemes shows up on the river just a little bit later, and Endymion's already gone, and she's just basically like standing there and sees Gyges' body and has to go into the river to get Gyges' head so that she can look at his memories, and she realizes that he's still alive, which is crazy because he's like decapitated. And so she it's interesting. They mentioned specifically several times, or Simmons mentioned specifically several different times throughout these particular chapters, that the emotions and sensations that are felt by Gyges and Nemes and her siblings, and their siblings rather, are minimal, if even existent at all. And I think that it's interesting that she sees that even in this horrific state, her brother, quote unquote, is still alive. She is supposedly unfazed, though I think that might change at some point in the future, which is why I think Simmons brings it up, because like they don't experience fear or anything like that. So I think we're just going to have to like find out what exactly is going on with all that. I just yeah. It didn't go well for Gyges. And it doesn't go well for Nemes as she figures out what happened. I'm surprised that this group of ne'er-do-wells isn't a little bit more nervous about the Shrike just like randomly appearing at any given time and giving them difficulties with whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. So she goes back to the ship and throws Gyges' body and head into the water. And I don't exactly know why. It doesn't say why. But then she says that to her siblings, like, hey, he's gone. We're going to have to go talk to Counselor Albedo. And if we remember correctly, Counselor Albedo was one of the advisors from the Techno Corps who was working for Maina Gladstone way back in the Hegemony. So I'm still holding out hope that we get to hear about Maina Gladstone, at least in this book, and what happened to her or where she's at. I would really like that to happen because she was one of my favorite characters in The Fall of Hyperion, but I don't know if that wish is gonna come true. But basically, Gyges is dead, and Nemes is heading back to report to Counselor Albedo, who we didn't know was alive. So there's all of that. But something else that's interesting that happens is what happens with, is it Ishimoto or Sakimoto? I can't remember. And I always feel like I'm being like, not PC when I can't remember the name of a character of ethnicity in a book that was written by a white guy. But I am earnestly just really bad with names. You've heard me not remember names the entire time that we've been doing these books. So I am not trying to like do anything weird or make bad jokes. I just don't remember his name. So last we left off with him, he had flown to this random comet and had tried to figure out, or was like meeting up with some informant of some kind. And someone had knocked on the door of his ship. Well, that person who had knocked on the door of his ship was Counselor Albedo. And Counselor Albedo basically proceeds to tell Ishimoto that that Albedo and the Techno Corps know everything about him. They know about his childhood. They know about the surveillance measures that he took in order to find out whether or not the Techno Corps was present on Pacham. And Ishimoto meets with him to try and like broker a deal to where the Pax Mercantilis is the one reaping the benefits from the relationship with the Techno Corps rather than the church. And they basically say like, look, we'll give you fame and fortune because we won't demonize you, and we'll actively work to not demonize you to the rest of the Pax. And that would be to your benefit because then you don't have to be in hiding anymore. And Albedo seems to like kind of be interested at first, and then very quickly turns the tables by talking to Ishimoto about like his childhood and saying like, didn't you have a pet shark? The way that the conversation starts is he references that time where Ishimoto made his intern take her clothes off, and he was like, this is the thing that holds the real power, the cruciform. And he wants to know why it is that the Techno Corps wants to hold that power over everybody. And so Albedo basically reveals it to him and asks, have you ever had a pet? What did you do when the pet acted up? And he said, oh yeah, you had a shock collar on it. He then proceeds to basically induce like heinous amounts of pain on Ishimoto through the cruciform. So what this tells us is that the cruciform is a collar for humanity. That is a major issue for their ability to advance themselves and totally keeps them at the behest of the technocore, because the technocore can basically manipulate individuals into doing what it is that they want them to do through the means of like torture and whatever else they decide is worthy of usage in regards to the cruciforms. And I was suspicious that the cruciforms had multiple purposes, one being surveillance, the other being some sort of like access to an interaction with the human body that otherwise wouldn't be possible. I thought maybe for a second it could be like mind control, but that is a little far-fetched even for a novel with time travel in it. I think that if that were the case, then Simmons would have already just said, like, everybody who has a cruciform is sleeping and living in this false reality, and everyone who doesn't is awake. But then we're just in the Matrix. So I think that I'm glad that that's not what they do. Though arguably being able to cause someone so much pain that they think that their body wishes it was dead is not a bad thing. And we do, if you remember correctly, the cruciform was able to inflict pain on its bearers back during the first iteration that Hoyt and DeRay had. So there's that. But yeah, so it's definitely interesting to see. And that is kind of where we're going to leave off with him, because basically Ishimoto just realizes that like he is totally screwed and doesn't know what to do at this point because he had no idea what he was really getting himself into. And Albedo just like walks back out of the ship as if nothing happened. So clearly Albedo is similar in his makeup to Radamanth Nemes and her ilk, but we'll see how that develops later on. The last person that I want to talk about is the Grand Inquisitor, who was on Mars inspecting an occurrence of the Shrike. And the Shrike what they find out is that the Shrike has only attacked individuals who have the cruciform. So there's a bunch of, they refer to them as New Palestinians in the book, who were not present when the Shrike attack occurred. And the Shrike attack actually removed all of the cruciforms from every person that it killed. Which is crazy because the cruciforms like really do, like the cross that shows up on your chest or wherever they implant the cruciform isn't like the cruciform. The cruciform takes up your whole body through like miles and miles of microfilaments and stuff like that is what they're referred to in the book. And for the Shrike to be able to remove it completely is pretty insane. Though because it can basically pause time and then do what it wants to do, it's not surprising. And I think there's some suspicion that the Shrike consuming cruciforms is what it like gives it more power, maybe. I don't know. It would make sense that could be the case because what we're starting to see is that there's a lot more division amongst the Technocore than we had originally thought, and that the division amongst the Technocore is something that's going to be much more important and relevant than we might have otherwise thought it would be. So I think we're going to see how that plays itself out as well. But what we find out very quickly is that there's actually a rebellion taking place on Mars, where the Palestinian people, the new Palestinians of Mars, are trying to take back their planet because reasons. They don't really go into detail, but they just start talking about how there is randomly out of nowhere this battle that's happening, and they're actually being, I think the end of that chapter ends with them actually being ambushed by a group of new Palestinians who are looking to take back control of their planet, I think. And I am suspicious that this is something that's going to start happening throughout PAX space, is that like other branches of religious individuals will start like rebelling against the church, in part because of the presence of the one who teaches being known. And I think that's part of the burden that Ania doesn't want to have to bear, is knowing that her existence causes the deaths of tons and tons of people, because they're all ultimately going to be like trying to ready themselves for her arrival in some regard. So I am interested to see exactly how it is that works. And I am interested to see like what it is that Ania's purpose primarily is supposed to serve. So we will find all of that out in the future, I hope. I don't know how much this book is going to resolve everything for us, but hopefully it's a lot. So that's pretty much that. And that's about all I've got for you guys this week. We're going to talk more about Endymion and where he ends up after he goes through the Farcaster portal, among a lot of other things on Sunday. So definitely stay tuned. Like I said, we're powering through this book, so hopefully we'll finish it faster than the other ones, and then we can move on to other things. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope everyone's been having a good week. Happy Halloween this upcoming Saturday, and stay safe out there. I hope that there's some places that are doing trick-or-treating if you have kids and that they're doing it in a safe way. I'm sure that there are ways to socially distance trick-or-treat. And we shouldn't ruin the fun of children if we can help it, in my opinion. So everybody have a safe week. Have a safe Halloween. And remember to get out there and vote. Early voting has started, and make sure you get your postal votes in as well. That's super important. If you can track it, track it. So thanks again, everybody, for listening, and have a great day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.